So today I'm going to explore some of the history of the Underground Railroad in Michigan, but also I'm going to be focusing on an incident that happened in Marshall, Michigan that came to be known as the Adam Crosswhite Affair. Now, this is sometimes a forgotten chapter in American history, but it is probably one of the most important incidents that happened on the timeline of American history that started the ball rolling on the abolition of slavery in the United States. So it's a very fascinating piece of history. It happened right here in Marshall, Michigan. So come along and join me.
To begin to understand this story, let's visit a time approximately 50 years before Adam Crosswhite arrived in Marshall, Michigan. In 1793, the first Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress. The act authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and impose penalties to anyone who aided in their flight. Although there were earlier state-level laws on fugitive slaves prior to this, this historically is considered to be the first major law passed by Congress. When the law was passed, it had widespread resistance to its enforcement. One of the most vocal and energetic opponents were the Quakers. Its passing resulted in the Quakers establishing what would become to be known as the Underground Railroad in the 1800s. A Quaker abolitionist named Isaac T. Hopper set up what is considered to be the first network in Philadelphia that helped fugitive slaves on the run. At the same time, Quakers in North Carolina established abolitionist groups that laid the groundwork for routes and shelters for escapees. In addition to the Quakers, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which came later, being established in 1816, was another proactive religious group that began helping fugitive slaves. Now, the first mention of the word Underground Railroad came in 1831 when an enslaved man named Tice Davids escaped from Kentucky to Ohio, and his owner blamed an underground railroad for helping Davids to freedom. In 1839, a Washington newspaper reported on an escaped slave named Jim, who revealed under torture by his captors that his plan was to go north following an underground railroad to Boston. Vigilance committees began to be created to protect escaped slaves from bounty hunters in New York in 1835 and also in Philadelphia in 1838, and soon their activities expanded to guiding fugitive slaves on the run. By 1849, the term Underground Railroad, although a covert activity for the most part, was part of the American vernacular. Most of the slaves helped by the Underground Railroad were from border states like Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. Now, a border state was essentially those states that were still slave states, but they bordered the free soil states or free states that didn't allow slavery. In the Deep South, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 made slave capturing a lucrative business. So there were few hiding places for slaves on the run in those areas. And when they were on the run, they were typically on their own until they reached certain points farther north, usually when they started to cross into border states. People known as conductors guided the fugitives. The hiding places included private homes, churches, and schoolhouses. These places were often called stations or safe houses and sometimes depots. The people operating them were called station masters. In Battle Creek, for example, Erastus Hussey was one of the well-known station masters who ran a station through his home and his business in downtown Battle Creek. There were many well-used routes stretching west through Ohio to Indiana and also into Iowa. Others headed north through Pennsylvania into New England. The route into Michigan typically entered from Indiana near Cass County at Cassopolis, and then they went across to either Schoolcraft or a little bit south to Centerville, and then they came up to Climax and went through Battle Creek, and then on into Marshall, Albion, Parma, Jackson, and eventually on over to Detroit. They also came up through Ohio, through Adrian, Clinton, and onto Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and then on to Detroit that way. There were a few other routes, one turning north from Battle Creek through the area of Charlotte, just south of Lansing, crossing over to the Canadian border to the north of Lake St. Clair. All the routes in Michigan would take them ultimately to Canada, crossing near Detroit into Windsor, or to the north at Point Edward in Port Huron Township. So this was the climate when Adam Crosswhite escaped from Kentucky with his family and ventured onto the Underground Railroad in 1846. His case would become nationally known and serve as the stone thrown into a pond, creating ripples that grew into waves and ultimately exploded into the American Civil War. In January 7th, 1876, almost a decade or so after the Civil War was resolved, an article ran in the Marshall Statesman, which was later carried in the Paw Paw, Michigan newspaper called The True Northerner, and it covered the entire story of what became known as the Crosswhite Affair, which was a detailed account of the events of 1847 and 1848 as it relates to the incident with Adam Crosswhite and his family and the community of Marshall and what happened during that time period. So I'm going to take you through that article now because it tells the story very completely. During the winter of 1847, there stood on the property now owned by Mr. James T. Downs in the eastern part of the city a humble dwelling. The house was located near a grove. A colored family occupied the place. The history of that family forms the subject of this sketch. Adam Crosswhite was born in Bourbon County, Kentucky, October 17th, 1799. His father was, under the laws of that state, his master, his mother being at the time of his birth a slave. At an early age, Adam was given by his father to his half-sister as a servant. Miss Crosswhite afterwards married Ned Stone, a notorious slave dealer who, if not the original Simon Legree of Uncle Tom's Cabin, might have been so similar were his life and character to those so graphically portrayed by Mrs. Stowe. Stone retained possession of the boy Adam for a time and then sold him to a man named Troutman for $200. When 20 years of age, the boy was traded off to one Frank Giltner, who lived in Carroll County, with whom he stayed until 45 years of age. When age 22, Adam married, and at the age of 35, was the father of 7 children. At that time, he became aware of Giltner's intention to sell a portion of his family. Watching for his opportunity, he obtained a skiff, which is a small boat, and with his family pushed off for Madison, which is over in Indiana, across the state line into free territory. There, he was received by the Underground Railroad managers and sent north. At Newport, Indiana, the pursuers came upon the party. By that time, it had swollen to a flock of 20 fugitives, and the fugitives were hidden by the Quakers and protected for many days. An incident is related during this time of how a young friend disconcerted the hunters. He represented himself as a slave hunter and gained their confidence, assuring them that he knew of the hiding place, and he took the party just at night into a dense swamp, leaving them on some slight pretext, but then failed to return. The party was lost in the woods all night, thereby relieving the poor slaves of considerable anxiety. Crosswhite, following this, was compelled to leave his wife and 2 of his children at this place and push on. His experience from Indiana into Michigan and his wife's experience 5 weeks later might be written up to form a very interesting book. Such is the rapidly traced history of the occupants of the little house above reference to. Crosswhite was known as an industrious, quiet man, and he paid a portion of the purchase money for his place. Now, it's important to understand at this point that when Adam Crosswhite and his family arrived in Marshall, they could have continued on over into Detroit and they would have had plenty of help to get into Canada, but he liked the community and he liked the people. He was kind of welcomed there. so he didn't feel like he was in any danger, so they set about to staying in Marshall and settling down. So I'm going to continue now with the article. Early in 1846 to 47 came to Marshall a young man who represented himself as a lawyer. He did not make known his business, but strayed through the town as though undecided about his permanent residence here. There was at this time residing here a man named Harvey Dixon, a deputy sheriff, whom the stranger seemed to take an interest in. Evidently, some work was to be done, and Dixon was the chosen tool. The stranger turned out to be Francis Troutman, grandson of the former owner of Adam Crosswhite, and his business in Marshall was to recover the fugitives. He had obtained a knowledge of their whereabouts through a friend to whom it chanced that Mrs. Crosswhite had unwittingly revealed her husband's location. Troutman was uncertain of the identity of all of the children and employed Dixon to impersonate a census collector and ascertain the required facts. This Dixon did, and it is alleged that he did it for the modest sum of $5. So in the meantime, it became noised about the town so as to reach Crosswhite, and a systematic attempt was about to be made to carry him and his family off. Troutman and his three dark-browed rascals, as one would ever care to meet, arranged with a liveryman to have a team ready on a given night at 12 o'clock. The liveryman left word at the stable that the horses were not to be sent until he gave orders. Orders were not given until toward morning. Crosswhite had become prepared, having heard about the forthcoming attempt to snatch him and his family, and so he was ready to meet his enemies. He had prepared an arrangement with his neighbors to come running when he fired a gunshot into the air. So it was understood that the gunshot signal was a signal for assembling his friends. So early in the morning, before it was light, Crosswhite saw the team coming towards his house. He fired a gun in the air and waited outside his house for the approach of the men. There were 4 in the party. Mrs. Crosswhite answered the summons to open the door by a stout refusal to do so. So 2 men placed their shoulders against the door and broke it down. The men then sought to persuade Crosswhite to go with them, saying they had come to arrest him and wanted him at the justice office downtown, and they offered to carry him and his family to the office in a wagon. This subterfuge did not work. In the meantime, about 200 people had assembled and were ridiculing the slave hunters. The 4 men were armed to the teeth but were too cowardly to use forcible means to take the runaways. Troutman said there was 1 child that he did not want, but the rest he demanded. They were all fugitive slaves, so he was in his right essentially to take them. So this speech of his received nothing but laughter from the crowd. It was understood by them that he proposed to take the mother and leave an infant, and so the crowd, who may have used threats against the 4 men, but that would be a disputed point, they essentially just laughed at him and ridiculed his group, which I'm sure that added to some of the hostility from these slave hunters. So later in the morning, 3 other men arrived after the incident had already started, and their names was Charles Gorman, Jarvis Hurd, and O.C. Comstock. And they went to the scene of where the trouble was happening, and they took no part in the proceedings, but they listened to the harangue of Troutman, who was offering resolutions to the effect of all law-abiding citizens need to follow my rules and that sort of thing, and that the people should not interfere with his taking Crosswhite and the family. Now, the fact that these 3 men showed up and they probably looked the part of stately members of the community, this was enough for satisfying Troutman that they were part of the trouble, and so he obtained their names and he wrote their names down. So finally the crowd went down to the Marshall house, and Crosswhite appeared on the streets and was advised to prosecute Troutman. So he did. So the attacking party were arrested and fined, Van Arman appearing for the prosecution. So later in the day, George Ingersoll quietly obtained funds and sent the family to Jackson, and he followed them in the railroad cars. At Jackson, the family entered the cars and were carried to Detroit, and then they made their way into Canada. So Troutman and his friends, who had been detained Troutman, during this time period, returned to Kentucky, vowing vengeance to the men who had aided in the liberation of the slaves. The vows made by Troutman were destined to be fulfilled, although it is probable that the loudmouth boastings of his party while here were more for effect than in earnest when uttered. Fate set her seal upon the acts of the marauding party and followed it with unrelenting acidity. Troutman related the incidents when he returned home to Kentucky that were connected to his defeat in Marshall. He told it to his friends down there and anyone that would listen. So indignant were they that steps were taken to convene a town meeting. The object was to insist upon the quote-unquote observance of the laws. In due time, the town meeting was held, and at the town meeting, Troutman grossly misinterpreted the Marshall affair. The citizens of Marshall were described as armed ruffians who resisted the execution of the laws of the country by force, and so forth. The outgrowth of the town meeting in Kentucky was raised up to a county meeting, and the object, which was similar to the primary assembly, and here again the northern outrage was repeated at this county meeting with graphic embellishments. And with the increasing size of the meeting grew more popular indignation of the falsehoods that Troutman and his friends were spreading. Troutman saw that there was no turning back from this course that he had taken and was determined to carry his point by dint to continued misrepresentations. So from the county meeting, the matter was taken to the legislature of the state of Kentucky, and there an appropriation was made to prosecute the leaders of the quote-unquote mob up in Marshall. So Troutman saw that there was no alternative, so he accepted the mission of returning to Marshall and teaching the cursed Northerners their duty. So when he arrived in Marshall, he hired pretty much all of the local attorneys in town, and he was a shrewd fellow and adroitly set to work to manufacture evil evidence to support the stories that he'd circulated in Kentucky, and upon which the strength of which his state appropriation had been made. So he'd been given money by the state of Kentucky to go up and prosecute, so he was bound and determined to try to find and prove evidence of these falsehoods that he created. So for several weeks, Troutman remained in Marshall, and his method of work was to meet a man who was easily influenced and ask him if he remembered hearing any of these men, Mr. Comstock, Mr. Gorman, or Mr. Hurd, say so-and-so or such and such on the day of the riot, and the fellow would partially recollect some of the speeches or some of what he was implying, and later in an interview the fellow would suddenly become positive, probably with a little bit of money slid under the table, and finally this man was ready to go up on the stand and swear to such language. Dixon, remember, who I mentioned earlier, was Troutman's right-hand man during this time. And so when sufficient testimony was obtained to warrant a trial, a suit was brought in the United States Court in Detroit. The defendants originally numbered a dozen or more citizens of Marshall, but then eventually dwindled down to the three men that he had picked on to begin with, Mr. Gorman, Jarvis Hurd, and O.C. Comstock. And so the trial began in the latter part of 1847 and lasted 3 weeks. So the outcome of the trial was that the jury disagreed and couldn't come to a conclusion. So they didn't find in favor of the Marshall men, and they didn't find in favor of the slave hunters. It was kind of a hung jury. So in 1848, the second trial began, and prominent Democratic politicians, now these were Jacksonian Democrats, they went to one of the defendants, Mr. Gorman, who was also a Democrat, but he was objecting to this whole issue of the slavery and slave hunters and all that. He didn't want anything to do with that. But they approached him in a friendly manner, and they wanted the case to go against the defendants. And Lewis Cass, who had been a former territorial governor and joined the Andrew Jackson administration a few years before Michigan became a state, at that time, Lewis Cass was now a candidate for the presidency of the United States. And as a politician, he wanted at that particular time, as it was expressed, that the South to be on his side in the upcoming election. And so he wanted to send a message to the South that they could understand that Detroit and Michigan sympathize with their slave-holding element. And so they were willing to, as per this article, prostitute themselves and commit an act of gross injustice to personal friends in order to secure the Southern vote. So they were willing willing to have their friend, who was a member of their political affiliation, sacrificed and receive a penalty, in this case, to satisfy the Southern vote in the upcoming elections. And they approached Gorman and they said, if you'll just agree to have this happen and this is the outcome and you go with it, we'll pay all of your legal bills. So when the case came to trial and was defended by 3 judges, and after a hard-fought struggle in the case, it was decided, as Lewis Cass wanted it to be, in favor of the slave hunters. And the defendants were required to pay about $1,900 in cost, which in today's dollars, that's probably the equivalent of about $50,000 in fines. So the men were so anxious to serve Cass's interest that they failed to remember their promises to help out the men that they had assigned fines with, and they left town. So these guys were stuck with these penalties. So that kind of created a wounded friendship between all of these people. 2 other prominent figures in the Marshall community stepped up and paid the fines for the defendants. So in this article, it says that the equities of this case were not considered by the court or jury, an illustrative, lamentable condition of the society in reference to the question of slavery and the subserviency of Northern men to the will of the South. And it was stated later that one of the jurors, who was actually a Whig, he said that it was extremely unpleasant to at least a portion of the jury to bring a verdict against the defendants, but they concluded it was best to do so on the account of the popular sentiment. So essentially, the jury had a faction within themselves that didn't want to do this. But apparently enough pressure was applied to them and the judges that they came through with the result that Lewis Cass and his party wanted. Now, there was consideration to take this and appeal it to a federal court, but those involved and the attorneys involved knew that that would be a fruitless endeavor because the federal courts at that time were heavily appointed Southerners on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so they didn't feel that a positive verdict would come from that, and the result would ultimately be very disastrous for the cause of trying to break down slavery in the country. So they decided that the appeal was worse than folly, that there was great injustice in this case, and they were not going to win a battle in that courtroom. Ultimately, what happened later was that Lewis Cass was defeated in the presidential election by Zachary Taylor, who became the president. But the case did not stop with the trial. And as described in this article, it was written on the scroll of fate that the seed sown in the soil of Marshall should bear abundant fruit. In later years, Henry Clay, in 1850, 3 years later, went to the Senate chamber after hearing about the whole Adam Crosswhite incident and having the pressure applied to him, as well as many other senators, to do something about the fugitive slave law. They wanted a stronger fugitive slave law. And so ultimately, Henry Clay introduced a massive batch of legislation which came to be known as the Compromise of 1850. And ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 included a new fugitive slave law, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. It had heavier fines, and it had prison time or jail time for those prosecuted for helping enslaved people find their way into freedom. So it was kind of believed that the Southerners intended to force the cooperation of their northern neighbors with this new legislation, but the outcome was that it further polarized both regions. And then there was a series of other events and legislation that came about following the Fugitive Slave Act that really took the steps towards the Civil War. The other things that I'll quickly mention: 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which really caused a lot of uproar. And then following that, in 1857, the Dred Scott case, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, also created a lot of turmoil across the nation because that decision implied that slavery could be put even in free states and that there's nothing they could do about it. And that was kind of how some people were interpreting it. And that created a lot of uproar. Ultimately, a year after that was the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, where all of those issues were brought about and fought and debated over a series of days as they were both running for the Illinois Senate seat. Stephen Douglas was the Democrat incumbent. Abraham Lincoln was the upcoming challenger of the new Republican Party that had been formed by a combination of the Whig Party and the Abolitionist Party. And Lincoln ultimately lost that election, but later would go on to win the presidency a few years later. It was during these debates that these debates were recorded with stenographers and a new technology that had recently been introduced at that time, which was the telegraph system. And the telegraph wires had been installed all the way out to Illinois. And so the reporters were reporting back the transcripts of these debates, and these debates were being printed in newspapers across the country. So that added kind of a lot of fuel to the fire, because you had both sides of this issue laying it out, taking the gloves off, and putting it out in the public spectrum, pretty much like our media does today. And it spread far and wide. And so when Lincoln was ultimately elected as the president, the South had their own opinion formed of him, and they did not like it at all. And of course, we know that the Civil War followed that. The first shots of the Civil War followed a short time after Lincoln's inauguration, and ultimately the outcome of the Civil War was an end to slavery. And as this article said, it obliterated slavery from the nation's tablets by the crimson hand of war.
So that's going to conclude today's journey through the history of the Adam Crosswhite Affair and its impact on the national stage during its time. It's sometimes a forgotten chapter in history, but I feel that it is probably one of the most significant events, because it was the first time that a group of individuals really stood up to slave hunters, and it hit the national stage as a result. And it set a lot of things in motion that ultimately ended in the American Civil War and obliterating slavery forever. So if you like today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, share the video with others, and if you want to support the work that I'm doing here by bringing Michigan history to the YouTube audience, I've got some links down there below that you could pick up some merchandise or make a direct donation to the channel. Any bit helps. And also be sure to check out my podcast on Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past. And I publish episodes on that every Tuesday and Friday right now. So come along and join me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.